Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day to you, and welcome to Launch Your Career. I'm Justin, and today's episode is game development. Certainly one of them that I am so excited about. Always passionate about gaming, and we got a really loyal following of gamers I know out on this show, amongst others. So today, my guest is Em. Welcome, Em.
Oh yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, awesome. I am so looking forward to kind of getting into some of the details of game development, different sub variations of it. And we're going to talk game development conference too, because that happened recently. Some amazing announcements and some interesting things there as well. Before we get into that, let's just go real quick. For those of you who have visited us before, of course, we have a code of conduct. I won't belabor it, but please be nice. Please be respectful, kind, but most importantly, ask some great questions of Em and myself, and we'll happily answer and such. So, all right. Well, first of all, Em, let's get to know you a little bit better before we get into some of the day in the life exploring a career in game development. Gosh, it's so easy to find an icebreaker for gaming. Let's just start with was there a first video game that you had that just inspired you, and maybe when you were a kid or at one point in the past and such?
Yeah, so on my fifth birthday, I got a Game Boy as a present.
Mm,
And the sort of family friends who gave it to me gave me a copy of Balloon Kid, which is sort of a fun little Nintendo game, really great for kids. But the Game Boy also came packed in with Zelda Link's Awakening,
yeah.
which, like, a big classic. It also was not quite appropriate for a 5-year-old. Not that it was too scary or inappropriate or anything like that. It was just far too complex and for confusing for me to know what was really going on. Um, but it is already this game that it's weird. Like, it's not like the other Zelda games. It is the sort of weird sort of dream logic. Like, it's explicitly inspired by Twin Peaks.
Yeah,
And so when
yeah,
you combine these relatively obtuse feeling puzzles of, like, okay, you find a raccoon who is a human who's been transformed, and so you have to find the witch and give her mushrooms to make a potion to turn him back into a human. Like, that is weird and confusing even before you are a 5-year-old who can't really understand it. So I think, like, that really inspired in me the sense of games can be these weird mystery boxes for you to slowly unravel.
yeah.
And, like, so now I'm really inspired by, there's this group called Arcane Kids. They're sort of a, like, indie game collective in LA. And years ago they put out a manifesto of, like, one of their points is the purpose of games is to hide secrets in.
Hmm.
And, like, that is something that deeply resonates with me. And, like, I draw that love of, like, finding the weird hidden things inside your games all the way back to Link's Awakening.
Yeah, yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, my first experience was interesting. The Legend of Zelda on the original Nintendo Entertainment System, NES or whatnot. But I don't know if I was five. Like, five is pretty young for many to be discovering Zelda. I don't know, maybe I was 7 or 8 or something like that. But it blew my mind that like you could explore a world that was outside of one's own domain and kind of transport you into a place like that. This is before I was old enough to read incredible books like fantasy or science fiction later on, and so like it really it just opened a whole new world to me. So it's funny that you mentioned Link and Zelda as kind of your first kind of entry point in that too. Of course, there was Super Mario. Of course, there was Duck Hunt, but Zelda was the one that captivated me, in a big way and
Yeah.
such.
Like, I think I played a lot of educational games and sort of had other exposure to games around that time. But
Yeah.
that, like, that mystique of this whole world to explore and secrets to find, I think, grabbed me more than a lot of the other stuff, even if I was concretely spending more time playing other things.
Yeah, yeah. You said something that made me remember of Oregon Trail for me too. I forgot
Oh.
about Oregon Trail and the triumph and tribulation of that as well. Well, moving it to more of a development topic, like, did you when you were inspired by that first video game or maybe the first few video games, was there a moment like a technology or a breakthrough when you were exploring gaming that just like became like that aha moment? Oh my gosh, I want to do this for a living, or I want to focus more on this professionally, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I wanted to make games for a long time. I think I remember, like, in second grade, them asking, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And, at one point I wanted to be a paleontologist and dig for dinosaurs, and at one point I wanted to be a veterinarian. But, like, pretty early on, like, game developer was on that list.
Yeah.
Um, But I think sort of separate from toying around and sort of not really knowing how to get into games as a kid, I think a lot of what's inspired me were sort of like when I was in like middle school, high school, college, that was sort of around the era of the Nintendo DS and the Nintendo Wii and then the original iPhone getting the App Store opening.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of what I've worked on professionally are games with novel input devices and sort of looking at like how does the way you physically interact with the game affect your emotional response to it, and loving that sort of like user interface angle to things. And I think I can draw a pretty clear line towards, yeah, these games that I loved playing in formative years were games that used the DS touchscreen in weird ways, or had you hold the DS sideways like a book, or using motion controls with your Wii. Like, I think that sense of experimentation is sort of a lot of where I draw my, like the well that I draw from.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. Yeah, I think mine, I like that you bring up kind of the user input and kind of alternative forms of user input and modality and how people think and feel on it for me. I think it was the graphics. For some reason, I was always drawn to music and graphics. Music, like the Final Fantasy series score of Nuvo Matzo was really like so important to me that I actually went and saw him and everyone in the Seattle Symphony in concert. And then like user input, or sorry, graphics for me, like there was this transformative moment where in Final Fantasy VII, Squaresoft put together 3-dimensional graphics and 2-dimensional backgrounds, backdrops at the same time, and it created this just amazing effect that had never been seen before in a video game. And I was fascinated by how they pulled that off from a technical perspective, right? The manipulation of the characters being 3D, but the background being 2D, because you can't render all those pixels in 3D at that time, you know,
and like all those pieces needing to be in place of like, even though you had some games like Donkey Kong Country that were doing like pre-rendered 3D graphics onto sprites, you needed the PlayStation because you needed a CD-ROM just to fit all of those high-resolution backgrounds to have like a full JRPG's worth of art assets.
Yeah, very cool stuff. Good to reminisce and such. Well, before we get to know you a little bit more, I just want to tell everyone out there that we do have a Cloud Skills Challenge on this. Part of this series is about trying out new job roles that you might be interested in pursuing, whether you're a beginner, a student, or a career switcher, someone who's thinking about considering a different career in technology, or just here to learn, or an educator. We've got a great Cloud Skills Challenge for you. So we've selected one module for each of the 24 job roles that we're exploring here, and you can check that out at aka.ms/launchyourcareerskills and such. Second of all, I want to profile game developer before we get a little bit more into what Em does day in the life. And so, of course, like most people right now, I checked Bing with ChatGPT to see what it had to say about game development. And specifically, I looked up like what are the different variations of a game developer. And there's some pretty interesting ones here. Perhaps a little bit of a generic output, but still interesting. But I got in here to AI engineer, physics, graphics, audio are all key components of variations. Design, like Em, we were talking a little bit about like the design and the aesthetic of games and things like that. But there's really just a lot of space here. No matter who you are, if you're interested in design, if you're super mathy and want to get into physics, or even cloud native itself, a lot of games are using and leveraging cloud technologies to make much broader games, make them much more multifaceted. We'll talk about that as well. So no shortage of great jobs out there in game development, I might add as well. I don't know, Em, do you have anything to add about like different role variations or things that, you know, career switchers might want to think about, these different sub roles and such?
Yeah, I think what I think is useful to talk about is a lot of people imagine like, oh yes, I want to be the person who comes up with the ideas. And I think we'll talk about this a little later, but it's worth separating out, like working on a small indie game team with 5 or 10 people is drastically different from going to like an EA or an Activision and being one person of thousands working on the latest Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed or whatever. But either way, I think sort of a consistent trend across them is if you want a career in games, you need to have a core skill that you are contributing, which is probably one of engineering or art or audio or design, where design very specifically means, you know, it could mean level design, it could mean AI design, it could mean economy design, but it is still very much like you are on the ground thinking through what does it mean to design this very hyper-specific aspect of this game.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you made a mention there about indie games as well, which leads me to kind of another question around that is, you know, what is the difference between indie game development, hobbyist, obviously like, triple A Call of Duty. Can maybe describe for us the different entry points or different ways a person might think about entering those different gaming segments?
Yeah, so I think we'll talk about entering and like what your entry point is in a second because I think that's a little complicated. But in broad
Yeah.
strokes, I would say like there are a handful of different ways that games are made. Like AAA at the high end, where again you have these large studios, deep specialization. You are sort of a cog in a machine, spending 5 years making a game, um, which is sort of like for a lot of people that's what they aspire to. Like that is the dream to contribute to these huge games. Um,
Yeah.
Sort of at the very end of the bottom of the spectrum, you have sort of hobbyist games. You're making a game on your own. You're releasing it for free, or maybe for some amount of money. Like you can, just pretty easy to put stuff on Steam or sites like itch.io. And
Mhm.
then you have sort of a long middle ground where a lot of indie game teams are a dozen people, 2 dozen people. They're raising hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars from publishers to get on the market. Like this is still a big business, but you still have that sort of small, scrappy startup feel. And there
Yeah.
are even some other studios in the middle there, sort of splitting that ground. And I would probably also draw mobile as a little bit different, just because there
Yeah.
are, if you're working on sort of casual games, as it were, um, those tend to be, you know, they can be drastically different sizes, but culturally they come more from the tech industry than from the games industry per se.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
like if you already have a background in web development, they're probably good, or native app development, they're probably going to use a lot more of the technologies you're all familiar with. Um, but I think a lot of that is also like qualitatively you are still making games. I think you are just
Yeah.
making them for sort of a different audience or a sort of different business concerns in terms of how things are made and sold.
Yeah, totally. Well, you mentioned entry point. Like, let's spend a few minutes on that because I think that really
Yeah.
is super important for this group of people that might be considering a career in game development. Like, in your mind, like, how do you enter the market? I know it's a big question, but like, let's unpack that
Yeah.
progressively and such, right?
Yeah. So I think there's sort of a first easy path that I will sort of get out of the way, which is depending on what your goal is. Like if you would like to, if you're really excited by sort of like server side software and sort of building big scalable servers, you can get those jobs at game companies and they will be very similar to what you would get at a non-game company.
Yeah,
um, like I think that feels almost like a parallel career path to talking about getting into games, because
yeah,
people like your Tencents, your Blizzards, your Riots, they have online games. Those games need servers. Your server doesn't really care if it is sending Call of Duty bullet pings or enterprise data into a database.
yeah,
um,
totally.
separate from that, I think the big thing is whatever your aspirations are, shipping games is what matters and is what gets you jobs. I think the act of sort of working on a small little prototype versus having to actually polish a game up for release and having to sort of make the hard decisions about what is in scope, what is not in scope, when are we done, what is the complete package, like that is sort of this one of the big things that differentiates someone who wants to make games from someone who is making games. And
Yeah,
so like if your goal is to make games on your own or on a small team or as a hobbyist, obviously making games is going to be the way to accomplish that. But I think also sort of as a hiring manager at a larger studio, I am going to be looking for what are the projects in this person's portfolio that shows they know how to actually ship projects out the door.
yeah. And you mentioned projects, and this kind of links back to one of the key themes that this Launch Your Career series has been about is building your own portfolio. For those of you who
Yeah.
are interested in getting a job role, including game developer, like having a portfolio of this. And so, fortunately, there are a lot of places to practice, and there's a lot of interesting things that you can do and experiment with and such. And so, in your mind, like where do you begin? Like what you're looking to do your first project. Do you pull your first library somewhere, or do you use a development environment, or like help us all understand where to get started there.
Yeah. I think I'll talk about technology in a moment, but I think the
Yeah,
first thing to call out is the existence of game jams. If people are familiar with hackathons, sort of broadly the same concept, there will be places where people will say, great, here is a weekend or a week or a month. We're all going to get together. You can find people to work with if you want or work solo. The goal is to produce a game.
yeah,
And there are sort of big game jams, like the Global Game Jam is one that takes place every year, where wherever you are in the world, you probably have one or two local sites you can go to and find people to jam with. But there's also a website I think I mentioned called itch.io that is sort of, they are primarily an online storefront for indie games. You can put up your own games on there for free or for sale, but they are also a big community of game jams. And if you go there now, you can probably find dozens of game jams happening at any given time. Which I think like finding ways to get connected with those is really great, because that is it both gives you a connection to a community to potentially find collaborators, because game design and game development is fundamentally a collaborative process. But it also means you then have audiences of sort of people who can play your games and give you feedback on it. And like getting tied into other people making games is a really important social component of sort of making network connections, getting experience, that whole sort of feedback loop that hopefully results in you breaking in.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, I think we've discussed in this series before, contributing to open source as an entry point, and just getting into the network of people and learning how to talk about it, learning the protocols for how to issue a good PR and follow and to write code that other people can understand and assimilate easily is important there. But I love the idea of a game jam, right? Like it's just getting there, even if you don't have a technical background immediately, or you're looking to get more technical, just being in that environment. And like you mentioned earlier, like thinking about the monetization of the economy elements of a game. I love the, it's a little bit of pun intended here, but a little game theory there where, you're thinking deeply about what people will find value in the psychology of gaming there, and start there. And then you'll find yourself, getting more into the details of the development itself and such. Sounds pretty amazing and such.
Yeah. And so then on the technical side, like I think if you are already a programmer, I think it is often very reasonable to take technologies you already know and use them to build games. Like I have a background in web dev. A lot of the games I build actually use React if they are sort of more like UI-based games rather than sort of twitchy action ones. But if you don't have those skills, or depending on what you want to make, sort of the typical tool in your tool belt would be a game engine, which, a couple decades ago, sort of every AAA game studio had their own proprietary in-house game engine that they built, and everyone would have their own sort of stack. Whereas now we sort of have a lot more options so I guess to take a step back, an engine is basically a collection of things you would need to use to make sort of a more actiony game. Like it gives you sort of rendering using either, like if you're doing a 2D game, it'll give you tools for sort of sprites and sort of doing animations and rendering 2D graphics on screen. If it's a 3D game and a 3D engine, it'll be tools for sort of rendering that 3D scene and loading models and placing your camera. It'll give you physics. It'll give you input, sort of all of these sort of bundles of tools that you need to sort of make a real-time simulation happen on screen.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing that you don't have to know all that math yourself to make a game. It makes it quite pleasant. I know years ago when I was in a web platform job role, I experimented with Babylon JS and one of the JavaScript frameworks that thought about 3D physics and that. There's also, like, for those of you who are just exploring coding, there's even like great tools like MakeCode that Microsoft makes, where you can actually build your own 2D sprite-based game by dragging code blocks. But all of that is based on like underlying physics engines that you as a developer don't have to write yourself. You can focus more on the creativity of the game or the customized features of what makes it unique and such, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think there is also a sort of like a separate thread of purpose-built engines. Like if you want to make a text-based game where you have sort of, you're telling a story and people are clicking on links in a web browser, you can use Twine, a game engine built for those sorts of browser-based games. If you want to make puzzle games, there's a tool called Puzzle Script for making sort of like Sokoban-style block-pushing puzzle games. And so there is a sort of whole world of, here are tools if you don't know how to program that will let you build a very specific game. You're just not going to have as much flexibility as a general purpose engine to say, like, this is the very specific thing I want to build.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Colossus on the chat asked a really good question that's related to this. So I'll go ahead and ask it here. What do you recommend if you have I'll call it technological experience or artistic experience? Is there a place for someone with more creativity or quality assurance without having the technology experience?
Yeah. So when I was just getting started, the sort of going advice was get a job in QA. That is a way to get your foot in the door, and then you can work your way up to sort of other development roles. I I don't know how true that is anymore. I think
Mm-hmm.
QA is really great. QA is extremely valuable and deeply undervalued in the industry. I think it is probably less true that like if your goal is to be a creative director, starting in QA is probably not the best path to be there. But
Yeah.
if you are excited by QA, if you love the idea of making a game better through testing it and finding all the edge cases and giving people detailed information they need to add that level of extra polish, QA is awesome. Um, I think there's sort of other constellations of sort of game development roles that aren't necessarily doing the core technical work or artistic work. Like I think community management is another one
Mm-hmm.
that it is really great to be able to like not only talk to the people and help like interact directly with the people who are making a game good, but also your job is very much to take sort of the feedback from your most passionate players and help your development team understand, you know, what do your players like, what do they don't like, what are their needs. Like that can also be super rewarding.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that. I mean, in today's games are social. They're community
Yeah,
driven. And so a lot of the value of a game that keeps it around for 10, 15 years comes in like there's this really strong, loyal community. And that doesn't happen by accident. Someone's thinking about, you know, what are the needs of the community and how do you make that best? So that's a great entry point. Never really thought about that before, but that would be great and such. Um, let's take the conversation in a different direction. You were talking technology, Em. Let's talk cloud native. So tell us a
yeah,
little bit more, like how does cloud native and cloud native architecture, enter into games at this stage?
yeah. There are a couple of different points. So obviously, if you are building a multiplayer game, you need a matchmaking service to connect people up with each other. You might need some sort of services for like friending and having friends, for voice chat, for actually hosting a multiplayer game once you've matchmade people together. Like that is a whole set of services that, you know, cloud native technologies are a great fit for. But say you're not making a multiplayer game, say you're making like a very traditional single player game. Um, Still looking at the sort of shipped live game side of things, you're still probably going to have a lot of backend services these days, like especially if you have any sort of live service component, meaning,
Mhm.
you know, maybe you're a free to play game, maybe you're still a premium game, but you're still, people are playing the game regularly. This is a hobby game they're going to play for years. You're releasing new content. You probably have some sort of, you know, user authentication. Maybe you let people log in on multiple platforms. You need to have cloud saves. You need to have maybe achievements, maybe some sort of leaderboards. Like there's a sort of base set of, you know, what is needed if you're going to release a game in 2023.
Mhm.
And if you're just released on Steam or you're just released on Xbox, you might just use those platform tools. But as soon as you're multi-platform, it becomes useful to have sort of tools that span across, you know, different vendors and aren't locking you into just your one console provider.
Mhm.
So you can build all that yourself. I do a lot of work with Azure PlayFab, which is a sort of all-in-one backend as a service. Sort of the goal is everything you need to host a game, they will provide it for you and give you great API hooks. Um, and then sort of finally on the actual day-to-day development side, I think increasingly more and more game dev is happening on the cloud. Sort of basic, you know, tools like VS Code and CodePilot are useful. We didn't talk about game engines specifically, but if you're writing like Unity code, I know a lot of Unity devs who will use VS Code as their C# editor.
Uh-huh.
But also increasingly, so like with the pandemic, for example, a lot of game studios, you know, had these build pipelines that were based on the idea of everyone is in the same physical space. If you're building a AAA game, builds are hundreds of gigabytes. How are you distributing that build to those testers? If you are building your game itself, you know, if you have a big, heavy AAA game, it is taking hours to do a build on a good computer. You don't want to use your personal computer for that.
Yeah.
Like we've seen a lot of shifting workloads to sort of very powerful VMs to do building, to do distribution to testers, to sort of handle a lot of this sort of unsexy but extremely important infrastructure of how do you actually manage software that like your average AAA game is a far more complicated piece of software than like an enterprise business application.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. Kind of blows my mind on that. And I like your point that, like, the pandemic really, I mean, arguably accelerated the transition of cloud native gaming or cloud native, development technologies into gaming too, because you had people that were located remotely that were coming together. And so like, I remember watching videos of AAA games being developed, and they had groups of people all in one room kind of working together. And then, then that changed. Right. And so it's amazing 3 years later, just how games get built and how they do so in such a distributed fashion and such.
Yeah, and that's been a really fun shift too, because a lot of indie games were already distributed. So like there are only so many people who make indie games. It is difficult to pay to get people all in the same place. Like if you are hiring for your indie game and you only have 6 people on your team, you want to hire the best people you can anywhere in the world, and you're only hiring them for a year or two to build a game, and then they're going to go on to do their other thing. It's very much like a film or like music band model of work, rather than having a salary job at a AAA game studio. So indie games were already largely remote before the pandemic, and there was this huge split where AAA is all in person, remote is not an option, while indies were completely remote by default. And you had a lot of cross-pollination between the two. Like a lot of indies go on to work at AAAs. A lot of people who have been at AAA for years quit to go do their own thing. But sort of those like ideas of how work should get done didn't really cross-pollinate between the two until we had an extra forcing function.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Louise, I'll get to your question in a minute, because I think the next question I'm going to ask is related to data engineering and how you might transfer your data engineering skills more towards gaming. Let's ask the question around generative AI. So generative AI is obviously, ChatGPT specifically is very popular right now, but AI has been around in gaming for a while. It's just in different contexts and such. But Em, can you share with us a little bit more, like if you're an aspiring AI engineer or you're thinking about generative AI, like how does that integrate with gaming?
Yeah, I think that is an extremely complex question. I think one angle to look at it is the games industry is already using a lot of AI tooling that other industries don't. Like even separate from like, yes, a lot of games have AI behavior and things like behavior trees to determine like how do enemies act. Setting all that aside for a second, like if you play a AAA 3D game and it has a lot of trees in it, an individual human did not model all of those trees. It was almost certainly built using a tool called SpeedTree that is an AI tool that generates 3D models of trees for games. And so I think, like, looking at the industry holistically, I think we're going to see a lot more sophisticated middleware emerge, which is sort of the term that we essentially use for third-party libraries, more or less. That like there will be more and more companies spinning up doing things like, cool, we know how to do this for trees. What new things can we do that for that we couldn't before, thanks to tools like ChatGPT? And so I think there will be, if you are someone who is like, I like the games industry, I want to help people making games rather than necessarily making them myself, I think those middleware companies are going to get bigger and bigger as sort of AI grows.
Yeah, I agree. And all of that is powered by data. So I think to kind of join Louise, your question as a data engineer, like if you want to, you're interested in maybe entering the game industry, maybe as a data engineer, some of these companies that are building middleware or other areas where AI models are being generated, we need someone to think about the data and think about it to create it in a right way that can be consumed by the model, and data scientists to be able to build the models themselves and things like that. So today's games are so data intensive. I think about I know one of my favorite examples is the more recent Microsoft Flight Simulator, right, where you can fly around the world and you have real-time rendering of the world based on some level of logic and data that's happening there as well. I was also thinking about like NPCs. Like I always think, like, go back to my old Final Fantasy or RPG days, World of Warcraft, where you go and you talk to a NPC that is a non-player character, for those of you unfamiliar with the acronym. And NPCs, like, you keep talking to them and they just say the same things over and over and over again because they have a finite set of investment that the game developers made in that particular NPC. But with like generative AI, you could make an NPC pretty intelligent, kind of interesting, and maybe even tune the model to extra emotion or something that's specific and such.
Yeah, so there's actually, like, at the Game Developers Conference a few weeks ago, there was a really interesting talk from a Ubisoft narrative designer about sort of the AI tooling they're starting to build in-house for authoring NPC dialogue. Where I think a lot of people who are writers and narrative designers who think a lot about this sort of authoring scenario I think from a UI standpoint, sort of letting people just like have a freeform text conversation with an NPC is probably like, I know studios who are doing it for prototyping. It's a really powerful way to like, if you are doing narrative design, the sort of field related to not just what are the stories you were telling, but sort of how are the ways that players interact with your story? How are the ways that sort of the mechanics by which narrative is revealed to the player? Like, how does that intersect with the rest of your gameplay? Mm-hmm. In a lot of games work, UI is extremely complicated and more expensive to build than just like throwing together a web UI. So having a conversational interface can be a really useful prototyping tool to look at like what is the form of this dialogue system, even though you probably don't want to let individual players like actually playing your game commercially like type at a keyboard. Like if nothing else, it's difficult. Like if it's a console game, that's a very different set of UI concerns. But I think what I'm seeing a lot of is both that prototyping, but also like a lot of what Ubisoft is doing. So like if you looked at the most recent Watch Dogs game, it has this entire procedural system where they're sort of this procedurally generated world of an infinite number of different characters. And you can sort of take any of these people and like bring them into your squad and go on adventures with them. Which means the act of writing dialogue and sort of barks, which is what we sort of call, everything from, someone shouting out like grenade incoming if it's a shooter game to sort of just like walking down the street and hearing someone, like those are all barks. It is one thing to sort of write out dialogue beats for characters. It is another complicated problem to say, cool, we have an infinite number of procedurally generated characters and we need to generate coherent story beats for them. It seems like a lot of their process was just a lot of manual work saying, cool, here is a set of things that need to be communicated. Here is a set of possible character archetypes. A human needs to go and manually match those things together. And I think like they're doing some very interesting, very targeted tool writing to solve those specific problems, where it is all about how do you take a writer who is good at what they do and augment what they do rather than deferring everything to ChatGPT.
For sure. Yeah, it's one of those assistive AI scenarios there. Maybe it's not all or nothing, right? It's a little bit of all, a little bit of human intervention to make sure there's quality and coherence to the story and such. Well, you mentioned GDC. What else did you learn? Like, was there any key themes that if you're a person entering the market, like you should be aware of, or what was trendy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's funny. So I didn't get to see that many talks. I'm excited to sort of go back to the vault later. Sort of the sort of energy on the ground is sort of Marvel Snap was the game of the year. Everyone was super excited to talk about Marvel Snap, the sort of mobile card game based on Marvel by the designer of Hearthstone. Which is fun to see sort of what is in the zeitgeist of cool. The business people are excited by, here is a mobile game that is making a lot of money despite having very different monetization models and sort of a little less aggressive than other free-to-play games, and as ways they can tune those levers. The designers are excited by, oh my goodness, this is doing cool, interesting new things with CCGs. It's sort of fun to see sort of like all aspects of the games industry all converging on like, oh yeah, this is the game we're talking about.
Yeah, that seems like an interesting one too. It's always interesting to think about like the differences between like the business and the economic opportunity in the games, and also like the technology and technological achievements of it. Like you need a little bit of both, but being able to make money in a thoughtful way without interrupting the gameplay substantially seems like a really good ticket, a good approach and such, right?
Yeah, and like a distinction I often like to make is, when asking people what kind of games they like or want to work on, like there's a big difference between a game that is like a movie or a book. You sit down and you play it and you're done. You had a good experience, versus sort of long-term hobby games where this is going to be part of your life for days or weeks or months or years, whether it is a thing you play for 5 minutes at a time on your phone or like a serious esport like thing where you are getting deep into skill mastery and gaining sort of deep player expression and skill over the course of a decade. And even though like the tools and techniques you're using for shipping these are all for making games, the way you approach them and the way you think about production is drastically different if you are pushing something out the door once versus, if you're releasing new content every month.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, speaking of skill, we've got just about 15 minutes left in the stream. I wanted Em to give you the opportunity kind of to show your skill and show like just a little bit more of like a day in the life of a game developer, what the tool set would be, what would you think about, how would you develop, and things like that. And so, would you be willing to take us through a little bit of your own art and science?
Yeah, sounds good. So unfortunately, sort of the project I'm working on day to day is not something I can show off yet. But I have a really cool project to show off, sort of one that we showed off at GDC actually as part of the experimental game workshop. Let me start screen sharing just so we can show this off.
And while she's doing that, y'all out there, feel free to ask some questions. We'll try to take some questions towards the end of the stream. And if you don't get your question answered, we are going to be airing another episode of this where we will be live on chat. We'll air the pre-recorded video, but we'll focus more on the chat window as well. But in the meantime, over to you, Em.
Yeah, so this is a project called A Little Game Called Mario, where a year or two ago, there was sort of discourse brewing of who's allowed to call themselves a game developer. What does it mean to sort of have worked on a game? Does it need to be commercial? Can it be a fun hobby project? Does developer mean you have to write code? Sort of really, really frustrating gatekeeping conversations. So her idea was, what if you worked on a little game called Mario? So when someone at a party asks you, hey, have you worked on any games I've heard of? You can say, oh, have you heard of a little game called Mario? So what she did was created this, she basically spun up a GitHub repository with a very simple 2D platformer built in the game engine Godot. And the idea is basically any reasonable contribution that anyone makes is accepted. We'll merge it in. If it's not offensive, it doesn't break the game. And then those changes automatically get deployed to itch.io. So we can have the sort of game that builds up over time through whatever the community wants. So it's worth stepping back to. I mentioned the game engine Godot. Sort of a thing we didn't touch on is there's sort of, we talked about game engines, the sort of big game engines you might use these days. Sort of Unity is sort of the default. This is sort of what most indie games are made in. If you want a job making indie games, Unity is probably what you want to learn. Unreal is the sort of fancier 3D one if you're making sort of high fidelity 3D games. Godot is the sort of small, scrappy, upstart open source engine. It's the only one that is fully open sourced. You can do whatever you want with it. I think its 3D tools aren't quite as mature yet, but it is a really cool, powerful 2D platform for making games like this, the silly little 2D platformer. And so just to give you a little context of what this looks like, we'll load the latest version of the game. So we can start it. I don't know if my audio will thread through or not, but there's some nice music. We have this sort of very complex, nice animation with Mario is running and has that trail coming behind him and the smoke, and we have all these levels.
That's cool.
Yeah, I think that's randomized. There are a bunch of different trails. We could pick. I have no idea what level this is. I don't think I'm going to jump in this room 100,000 times, but something may or may not happen if I do. But this also expands all the way to, I don't actually know how to pick our other game modes now. Maybe. Yeah, so we have, for example, here's a full 3D Star Fox style game.
Nice, very nice. I remember this one.
And there's like a Dance Dance Revolution style rhythm game. There's sort of all these other different things you can play in here that just someone said, hey, it would be cool if there was a rhythm game, and they built a rhythm game. So I'm going to unpresent and represent so I can show you what this actually looks like in the editor. Cool, yeah. So this is the Godot editor. Oh, I don't think we're live yet.
Want me to go ahead and add it to the stream?
Oh, yeah, that would be good. Yeah. Yeah. So this is the Godot editor. This is what a lot of game engine editors look like. Where if you're used to sort of writing code in a text editor and clicking run, this is going to be pretty different. Like if I click play, it will just load the latest copy of the game. Oh, you can't actually see that because I'm sharing the window. But believe me, it's playing the exact same thing we are playing in a web browser. But we have sort of this sort of interactive editor where we can take individual objects and move them around and do whatever we want with them. And sort of most game engines like this are built on what's called an entity component system, where sort of this object here is a bundle of player behaviors. So like this is a sprite, and it has a bunch of properties associated with it being a sprite. It is a, oh, it's not a particularly interesting one. Let's find a more interesting one. Let me find our player object. So down here, we also have the sort of list of all the scenes we're dealing with. Scenes. Yeah, let's look at our rhythm game. Where is the scene for this? There is no scene here. Yeah, so we have sort of a scene file where everything is organized into individual levels or sort of scenes, depending on the editor you're using. Or if we look at this Luigi, for example, aka Green Mario, it's got an animation player to play sort of an idle animation, and that has a bunch of behaviors attached to it. It is a sprite, which has a bunch of behaviors attached to it showing on screen and rendering. It has a beat player, which is doing something. We have to sort of look at the code to see what it's doing, but it looks like it's sort of a, it is a type of animation player. So probably related to sort of letting it animate on the beat. And then the way you'd sort of integrate code with this is we can sort of have these scripts attached to behaviors. So like this dance actor script has a bunch of sort of automatically called functions. So like this process function is going to call, every tick. Sort of game engines, the sort of control flow of a typical game engine is, you can think of the whole process as the single like while loop, where cool, every iteration you're going to go through every character in your game and tell it to update for whatever update means or process. If they're sprites, they will have this sort of their position set, and then you'll go through and you'll render all of them. At some point, you're probably processing input, and then you're done. You do that again 60 times a second. Will give you, a frame rate of 60 frames per second. And so here you will have, cool, here's what happens every time we hit a new frame. This dance actor is going to, determine based on some beat per minute logic, because there's probably some pretty complex logic around how to make it a rhythm game that will sort of execute every time to figure out how to make that happen. And so a lot of working in a game engine like this is figuring out, cool, how are we going to assemble things to the correct areas we want them to be? And then we're going to write some behaviors that do what we want them to. This is probably not the most productive example. Maybe I will find, where's our basic player? So this is like the basic, if you look at the 2D platformer character who is jumping and running around like Mario, this is going to be much more complex logic. Because there's used typically like a character controller like this, which is what we would call sort of that 2D character moving around the screen, has a lot of pretty complex logic around, what does acceleration and velocity feel like? We talk a lot about sort of game feel or juice in terms of, how do you make something feel like Mario and really satisfying? Like I think a good example of this, I wish I could easily show them running around, but
Are these default like in the game engine, or is this all custom code that was written?
This is all custom code that was written. So you can often, like, if you're doing something like a 2D platformer, you can probably find some third-party code that someone has written of like how to do a character controller. But this is all custom code that somebody on this project has written, or in this case, probably, a dozen people over time.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah. And so like, I think a good example, I don't know, let's see if we can try to find it. Yeah. So like we have this variable here for coyote time, which is sort of like a very common trick in the business for how to make 2D platformers feel good. If you've ever seen like Wile E. Coyote cartoons, there's a bit that often happens where he runs off the edge of a cliff and sort of stands there for a moment and then looks down and sees, oh, whoops, I went off a cliff, and then falls down. Where often, like if you're making a 2D platformer, if you press a button, you jump. If your naive logic would be, cool, if you're on a surface and press the jump button, you jump. However, if you are off of a flat surface, you are falling, you cannot jump. But players do not have absolute perfect reaction times. It's deeply dissatisfying to run off a cliff and press jump, and it feels to you like you jumped just at the ledge, But as far as the game is concerned, like, sorry, you were off that ledge for 1/60th of a second before you pressed the jump button. You didn't jump. So you'll add something called like coyote time or similar to say, hey, if the player jumps, if they were on a platform in the last n frames, let's just give it to them.
There's a tolerance or a reasonable factor, right? Because otherwise, computers can process so quickly. Like, you touch the Goomba, and 1 millisecond later, right, you're dead. Well, maybe if there's a 2 millisecond lag, if somebody was going towards the Goomba and then back, right, maybe you give them the benefit of the doubt, right, for collision.
Yeah, and so like a lot of what you're doing depends a lot on what type of game you're making, but like for this sort of 2D platformer, a lot of it does come down to, cool, what are these different tricks and tips that we know for how to make this feel good? And
it showcases just how complex games can be, because by the time you pick a sprite, it has properties, right? It collides with other sprites, right? It navigates an environment that doesn't fall off the cliff, and that, like, there's a lot to it. I think I've always just found such a fascination, and that's just the 2D realm,
Yeah. And yeah, so I do want to also call out that, like, I'm sort of giving you the very high level overview of what this is like as a large complex Godot project. But as I mentioned, this is fully open source. You can download this yourself. You can poke at this full thing in Godot. This is just the public version. If you were like, oh, I really want to try, figuring out how to contribute, you can make your own contributions to this game and open a pull request. And it doesn't necessarily need to be like, yes, you are a master of how to make 2D platforming feel good. It can be something as simple as, like, cool, we have those, animated tails of like the flags while you're moving. You could add another flag. And that is a really great way to be like, cool, I've made a contribution to a game. I'm feeling a little more comfortable now and feeling like I can start to make sense of these large complex systems.
Yeah, like even like implementing a hard mode, right? Hard game difficulty mode. Like you can come in, manipulate some parameters, right? Maybe decrease coyote time or something like that.
Yeah.
And then issue a pull request and say, like, this is how hard mode is invoked in the menu. It is how how the game environment changes as a result of that. Something as simple as that is a way to get familiar with a complex piece of software like this, and then as you build confidence, being able to change and edit and do pull requests against more things, add more features and such, right?
Yeah,
love it.
And if we have time, the other quick demo I will do is I do want to show off PlayFab too, just to give that other side of things.
We've got plenty of time to do it. Go ahead.
Cool. Let me pull that up. Cool. If you could pull up this screen now.
Okay, coming up. There you go.
Yeah, so this is an example of the PlayFab dashboard, which I think is cool to see sort of what is that cloud native side of things, of sort of more, back-end services, what it's like to run an online game. This is sort of a weird example because I picked sort of the game that has the most data in it, but it's sort of less live. It's complicated. This used to be a game called Flappy Royale, which is a 99-player battle royale version of Flappy Bird, where saying a lot of this is sort of not live. Like Apple and Google keep trying to take us down because they think we're infringing on Flappy Bird's copyright, even though we are using all of our own art assets. But you can see, like, this shows us, cool, all of our user logins. Oh, we can't actually show you. Can we get players here? Yeah, so you can see all of these different players of, like, cool, here's a different person who has, a display name. They have some data attached. They've attached their iOS device and authenticated with Apple Game Center. Mm-hmm. They have, I don't remember we're gonna find that data, but so like this, we have the concept of unlockable like cosmetics. You could, as you're playing, you might find like a loot box of sort of different, a cool little hat that you can wear. And we store all of this. PlayFab has this full complex economy system where, cool, here are all of these different unlockable items you can wear, and we have metadata attached to them. I sadly don't think it's going to let us show you the image. I think like the actual images are stored in the game itself rather than the browser.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but we have sort of this whole complex system of, cool, all of the items that you might unlock in the game are in this beautiful web interface that we can edit. When we give you sort of a loot box or like, cosmetic chest that gives you an item, we get to define, not writing code, just writing sort of data in a web browser. Cool. If you get this kind of loot box, you have a 3% chance of getting the kangaroo hat or the the sort of punk racer hair. And it's really cool to be able to just define all of that. Sort of, there's the concept of the game engine itself, and then there is the sort of backend services. And here, sort of people who are working on that side of things and making the art assets for these items and figuring out how rare they should be, not having to sort of dive into code themselves, being able to do that entirely via sort of these friendly tools, I think is really, really cool. And like, again, to talk about the business side of things, like this was a free-to-play game. You could watch an ad to unlock some of those loot boxes, and we had these sort of very complex flows of, cool, when the game wants to show you an ad, we are talking to a video ad provider who is serving up an ad to the player, who then talks to PlayFab to assign the player a consumable object in their inventory that they could then consume to open that loot box, as it were.
Yeah, very cool. And I mean, it allows you to add sophistication to your game much more easily. So you can focus more on what makes the game unique or different, or game mechanics, or that. But you have this cloud native infrastructure to be able to create, like you said, like leaderboards or economic elements of it. It seems pretty amazing that you can administer all of this centrally, and then allows you to build a more cross-platform game too.
Yeah, like at this point, like no matter what kind of game I'm making, by default, I just throw PlayFab in because it's so great to have. Cool, we can store players' games on the cloud. We can store analytics and sort of get a sense of how many people are playing the game, and they send you a nice daily email of, cool, here's your daily active users, how many people logged into the game yesterday, here's your monthly actives, a lot of the sort of key stats you care about, which is super cool.
Yeah. I should add that there is a free tier of PlayFab too, so you can check this out yourself without cost, especially as you're experimenting and such.
Yeah, I think like a lot of the multiplayer services, like if you want actual multiplayer servers, the sort of free tier is a little different. But for the base, like player data, analytics, all of that stuff, you basically have everything for free until you have 100,000 users, which, like, great if you're just getting started and building your own game for fun. If you hit 100,000 users, great. That's a very good problem to have.
Yeah, that's a very good problem to have. Well, Luis asked a really good question related to this, and Sergio, I want to get to your question at the end too, because it's a great one. But how does PlayFab impact the whole development process for developers? Like, if you had to, if you were in what, I guess I'll also kind of paraphrase, in what sequence do you add this as you're building your game?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the type of game you're building. Again, I think that split of is this sort of like a quote unquote premium game, like a boxed experience, versus like a live service game.
Yeah.
Where I think in either case, you are probably building a fun game first and figuring out what is the core sort of interaction loop, is a lot of the way we talk about things. Of like, cool, you can sit down with this game and play it and have fun with it. And then you start adding on these sort of larger overarching systems of, cool, how are we getting, what is this long-term sense of progression, which is where you might start to bring in an economy and different currencies and different ways for player to earn and unlock things. That's when you might start thinking about friend systems and letting people have social interactions in your game. I think the exception to that is the analytics module in Cloud Save. I guess Cloud Save is probably close to the end of development anyway, but one of the most important things for someone getting started in games is getting used to playtesting and getting used to the idea that, with games, you can watch a movie or read a book or watch someone do that. And so I know that you watching a movie that I've made, a certain moment may or may not hit. You may have a different emotional experience than I intended, and I can tweak that. That is very different from games where feedback is of the form, this is a complex interactive system. You may interact with this in ways that I don't expect you will, in ways that fundamentally changes the way the game works and breaks it. So getting frequent feedback is far more important for games than most other creative mediums. And talking about how to get good playtesting data, we could talk for an hour about that. But I think for a lot of types of games, especially sort of like live service games, a key component of that is not just sort of qualitative feedback of letting people play your game and watching them play it or ask them for feedback, but looking at analytics and looking at sort of hard numbers of, once you have a bunch of people playing your game, what are they doing? What are they interacting with? How are they engaging with it? And having something like PlayFab in place to give you those sort of hard analytics hooks is, I think, much more important for games than sort of most other artistic media I've worked on.
Yeah. Yeah. Data-driven insights, super important. Also a cool sub-variation job role that one can have at a game development company as well. So if you've got a background in data and analytics, I think gaming, thinking about engagement, thinking about what players really want, thinking about how to monetize and how to do so in a thoughtful manner that is fun and not disruptive to the game. Those are all really, really interesting areas as well. All right, well, we're about out of time, so I want to end with what I was going to ask anyway, but Sergio asked it even better than me, which is, are there any courses or resources that you would recommend if you're wanting to get into game development?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it depends on what you would like to do. I think if you know, like, I would like to program a 2D or 3D game, like picking a game engine that sounds good, which is probably Godot or Unreal or Unity. And though, like, they will typically have sort of very good first party learning portals. Like Unity has a whole wealth of educational content for learning how to do anything in Unity, and they're all very good. Like I've contributed to some of Unreal's guides and the similar thing. Like I helped build a course for using Unreal to build HoloLens experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I think sort of that path of let me learn how to use the tool is definitely one path to go. Another path is if there are specific types of games you want to make, finding purpose-built tools for that. Like again, if you want to make narrative games, I would look up tools like Twine or Bitsy, or something like Puzzle Script for puzzle games. Like these are all really great tools where again you will find good advice for here is how you use this exact tool to build a thing. And for me, at least, the feedback loop would be learn how to do what you need to do with a tool. And then that's going to give you experience for the overall process of what is it like to build and ship a game, which will then sort of point you down other directions. The other thing I would say is if you are sort of more interested holistically in sort of what does it mean to design a game, what are good design processes and best practices, I think there are a bunch of books that are really useful.
Mm-hmm.
Like Richard Le Marchand has a really good book about game production processes and like how do you structure sort of building a game over time. Anna Anthropy and Naomi Clark have a really good book whose name I can't remember, but we can sort of find it and sort of put a link somewhere of like, what does it mean to make a game from start to finish with sort of an eye towards like they are both coming from sort of more independent and artistic spaces,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of helping you find a lot of those sort of lower code tools. Yeah, I don't have like very specific, like this is a good course or this is a good YouTube channel to go to, other than like the engine tool resources are very good sites. Like a lot of game developers just learn Unity from the official Unity guides.
Yeah, I mean, old rule of being a developer: go to the docs and just explore and experiment and such. I think those are great recommendations. Yeah, so we have some resources on Microsoft Learn as well. If you haven't all know about that, we can explore that too. Em, you mentioned web development earlier. Just learning the basics of web development, especially as it pertains to gaming, I think would be valuable as well, really. So the sky's your limit. There's so much to focus on there. So wrapping up today, Em, I just wanted to thank you for being a guest here. I thought the discussion was great. I love reminiscing of games and thinking about game development and how far it's come. So thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You bet, you bet. So, well, joining us next week for our Launch Your Career series. Actually, I said next week. I think we're going to take a week off because we've got a different major event happening here at Microsoft. But joining us soon for more episodes of Launch Your Career. And in the meantime, do check out our Cloud Skills Challenge, Launch Your Career Skills, that includes some game development modules and things like that as well. So, thank you and have a great day. Cheers.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks again, Em.